Okay, so talking about atonement and everything, there are several factors at play with atonement. Let's personify justice and mercy and love, and they're having a little conversation. Talk about how they would talk to each other and what each of them would represent.
Well, God at some point in eternity, we don't know when, decided to make man in his image, or at least in our way of thinking, he might have proposed the idea. I'd like to make man. In fact, he even stated it, let us make man in our image. Justice would immediately stand up and say, you can't do that. And righteousness would say, you can't do that, because you know, God, they will sin. And you can't create something that will sin. That would be outside of your nature. It just can't happen. And you can't, and sin must be penalized. Before God ever sent the prophecy, the soul that sinned must die. It was already in the mind of God, because the law of God is eternal. So justice and righteousness said, you can't do it, because the soul that sinned must die. And so you'd be creating something that must die, and it can have no hope. It just can't be. But God said, I want to do it. So you could say God had a dilemma. Something he wants to do, his own nature says, can't do it. But then something else jumped up, called mercy. Now mercy says, yeah, they sinned, and they should die, but I don't want them to die. And righteousness looks at mercy and says, what are you talking about? They would have to die, or it wouldn't be just. And justice would say, I agree. You can't have righteousness and stuff with mercy, because mercy is a form of injustice. When we hear people say, we want justice, we demand justice, they either want someone to be set free or someone to die, because justice either demands freedom or death. And if they sin, they should die. And justice says, you can't have mercy, because mercy says, I don't want them to die. And righteousness says, that's true. It can't be right if they don't die. So God had a dilemma. And then came a wonderful word that we call grace. Grace says, I have a solution. I myself will take them into death. I'll lay my own life on the table. Now, if you've ever set up a business or tried to, before you start your business, you need to take into account a lot of factors. How much business will you be able to do? How much money will come in? And will there ever be any bad accounts? Will someone write you a bad check when you've done the work and they paid, but the check bounced? Who's going to pay that loss? Well, it's going to be you. Are you prepared to pay that loss? If you're not prepared to make up the difference, then you best not set up the business. But God says, I can pay the price for the sin. Some people have asked, what is the penalty for sin? The usual answer that people give is death. Death is not the penalty for sin. A penalty is a payment that satisfies a debt to the law. That's what a penalty is. Death is the result of sin. If you walk off the top of a high cliff, you're going to die. It's not a penalty, it's just the result. That's what happens if you walk off a cliff. People die because of sin. But if death were the penalty for sin, then the minute somebody dies, that would have paid the penalty. And even the worst human law says once the penalty's paid, you got to release them. No one ever gets released from death because it doesn't pay the penalty. The only penalty that is paid that satisfies the law is the death of the Lord himself. So before God ever created one atom of anything, he had already put up the what we would call the collateral to cover the cost for sin. He put his own life on the table, and it says that Jesus was the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. So you might say that Jesus died twice. Once before the foundation of the world in the realm of eternity that we can't comprehend, and once in the literal world that we can visualize. Which one was the most real? The one that was before the foundation of the world, or the one in our literal time? They were both real, and they were both necessary. The first one was done because it had to be, before he could create anything, the price had to be paid. So the money was laid on the table before he ever made one thing. Then he did it in our time, because unless he shows us the parable, we can't see it. So you might say that the death of Jesus on the cross was a parable. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it means it was to show us a greater picture. The picture of him himself laying his life down as the penalty for our sin. But he says in order for it to apply to us, he has to put us into that death. And then we are put into the death, it says in Romans. It says, in that he died once. He can never die again. And he says to you, you died the same as his death. If he can never die again, what about you? He says, in that he is resurrected, he can never die again. And he said, you are to account yourself. In other words, write it in the book. That word account means like an accountant keeping the record. Write it in your record book. I have been resurrected with Christ, never to die again. And so, if you could die again, then so could Christ. Can he die again? How about you? So there's your losing your salvation. If you could lose your salvation, then God would have to reverse what he did on the cross. There were those in ancient Israel who tried to stone Joshua and Caleb and Moses and elect new leaders to go back to Egypt. Couldn't happen. The Lord said, I brought you out of there. You're not going back. I don't care how much you want to or even try to. Can't do it. You're my people. You're going where I take you. You might not always like it, but that's where we're going.
So, in our modern day age, if somebody comes to God, they can't go back to Egypt either?
They can't go back to Egypt, because going back to Egypt means becoming a slave to sin. Can they go into idolatry? Absolutely. Can they go into rebellion? Absolutely. Can they even threaten to turn around and go back? Sure they can. I can picture God up there saying, words, words, words. You just babble on, and he slaps them around a little bit and says, now listen, you sit in the corner over there, and when you straighten up, we're going to go right on where we were. God's a great teacher.